In the dusty summer of 1879, when the Wild West was still wild and prejudice ran as deep as canyon walls, two souls met on the Texas frontier in a way that would challenge everything their world believed about love, race, and human connection. She was a young black woman named Sarah Mee Johnson, traveling west with a wagon train of freed slaves, seeking new lives in a land that promised opportunity, but delivered mostly hardship. He was a white rancher named Thomas Whitfield, a man of 32 years who had built his life on solitude and land, never expecting his heart to betray every social rule he had been raised to follow. Their eyes met across a crowded trading post in a town called Redemption, and in that single moment, something shifted in the universe, something that neither the laws of men nor the prejudices of society could prevent. This is the story of how love found a way when the world said it was impossible, how two people from different worlds built something beautiful in the face of hatred and fear, and how their courage to love each other changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who witnessed their extraordinary journey. It is a story of patience and waiting, of a man who understood that true love could not be rushed, and a woman who learned that trust could be earned even in a world that had given her every reason not to trust. Sarah Mee Johnson was born into slavery in Mississippi in 1858, just 3 years before the Civil War would tear America apart. She spent the first 7 years of her life in bondage, too young to understand what slavery truly meant, but old enough to remember the fear in her mother's eyes and the exhaustion in her father's bent shoulders. When freedom came after the war, Sarah's family celebrated, but freedom turned out to be more complicated than they had imagined. They had no land, no money, no education, and the white people who had once owned them were not willing to help them build new lives. Sarah's father worked as a sharecropper, essentially trading one form of bondage for another, while her mother took in washing and tried to keep their family fed. Sarah grew up watching her parents struggle, seeing them work themselves to exhaustion for wages that barely kept them alive, and she understood from a very young age that being free on paper did not mean being free in reality. When Sarah was 19 years old, her parents died within months of each other. Her father from pneumonia he caught working in the rain, and her mother from a broken heart that simply gave up. Sarah found herself alone in Mississippi with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination not to spend her life the way her parents had spent theirs. She heard about wagon trains heading west, about communities of black settlers claiming land in Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma, about the possibility of owning property and building something that belonged to you and no one else. She sold everything her parents had left, which amounted to almost nothing, and used the money to buy passage with a wagon train heading to Texas. She had never been more than 20 miles from the plantation where she was born, had never seen a mountain or a desert or the endless sky that stretched over the Western territories, but she was willing to risk everything for a chance at a different life. The wagon train Sarah joined consisted of 43 black families, all of them former slaves or children of slaves, all of them carrying dreams of land ownership and independence. They were led by a man named Ezekiel Freeman, a former Union soldier who had fought for his freedom and was now fighting for a future. The journey was brutal in ways Sarah had not anticipated. The heat was overwhelming, turning the covered wagons into ovens that baked everyone inside. Water was scarce and often dirty, leading to sickness that claimed the lives of 3 children and 2 elderly people before they even reached the Texas border. There were also dangers from raiders, both white outlaws who saw the travelers as easy targets and Native Americans who were defending their land, from yet another wave of settlers encroaching on their territory. Sarah proved herself to be stronger than anyone expected during this journey. When people got sick, she helped nurse them, drawing on knowledge her mother had passed down about herbs and remedies. When food ran low, she was among the best at foraging, finding edible plants and roots that others would have walked past. When morale dropped and people talked about turning back, Sarah was one of the voices encouraging them to keep going, reminding them that nothing worthwhile had ever been easy. She became respected within the wagon train community, someone people turned to when they needed strength or wisdom, or simply a reminder of why they were enduring such hardship. After 4 months of traveling, the wagon train reached their destination, a stretch of land in western Texas, where the government was allowing homesteaders to claim parcels if they could prove they would work the land and build on it. The area was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky soil and limited water, but it was available, and it was theirs for the taking. The families began the process of selecting their plots and starting to build, and Sarah claimed a small piece of land that sat near a creek that ran dry most of the year but held water after rains. She had no experience building a house or farming, but she learned by watching others and by making countless mistakes that taught her what not to do. She built a small sod house, barely more than a hole in the ground with walls and a roof, but it was hers, the first thing she had ever owned. The settlement struggled through its first year. Crops failed more often than they succeeded. Cattle died from disease and drought. Some families gave up and headed back east or pushed further west toward California. But Sarah stayed, determined to make this work no matter how many times she had to start over. She took on work cooking and cleaning for other homesteaders who had slightly more resources, saving every penny she could. She learned to shoot a rifle to protect herself and her property. She survived a winter that froze her water supply and nearly killed her livestock. And through all of this, she remained focused on her goal of building a life that was truly her own. Sarah met Thomas Whitfield for the first time in the spring of 1879 at the trading post in Redemption, a rough town that served as the main supply center for all the ranches and homesteads in the area. Sarah had saved enough money to buy a mule, which she desperately needed to help plow her land and haul supplies, and she had heard that someone in town was selling one at a reasonable price. She walked into the trading post wearing her best dress, which was still patched and worn but clean, and she carried herself with a dignity that demanded respect, even if the world was not always willing to give it. Thomas Whitfield was standing at the counter buying supplies when Sarah entered, and he later told her that the moment he saw her, something in his chest tightened and his breath caught in a way that had never happened before. She was beautiful, with dark skin that glowed like polished wood and eyes that held intelligence and strength, and a wariness that came from living in a world that was often cruel. Thomas found himself staring, and when Sarah noticed and met his gaze, he quickly looked away, embarrassed and confused by his reaction. He was not supposed to feel this way about a black woman. The society he lived in had made that abundantly clear, but his heart seemed to have missed that particular lesson. Sarah noticed Thomas looking at her, and her first reaction was caution bordering on fear. She had learned to be wary of white men who showed interest in black women, because that interest was almost never respectful or honorable. She had heard too many stories of black women being taken advantage of, assaulted, or worse, by white men who faced no consequences for their actions. So when Thomas approached her after she completed her business at the trading post, asking if she needed help loading the supplies she had purchased, Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse and get away as quickly as possible. But something in Thomas's manner was different from what she expected. He was nervous and respectful, keeping his distance and seeming genuinely concerned rather than predatory. Sarah allowed him to help her load her wagon, and they exchanged a few words, nothing significant, just pleasantries about the weather and the quality of the goods at the trading post. Thomas watched Sarah drive away in her wagon, and he could not stop thinking about her for days afterward. He asked around town, trying to learn who she was without seeming too interested, and he discovered she was one of the black homesteaders who had settled outside of town, that she lived alone, and was trying to make a go of farming despite having no experience or resources. Thomas found himself riding past her property more often than was necessary, always finding some excuse for why he needed to travel that particular road. He never stopped or approached her, just watched from a distance as she worked her land, and he began to understand that what he was feeling was not going to go away just because it was inconvenient or socially unacceptable. Thomas Whitfield had been raised in Virginia, the son of a moderately successful tobacco farmer who lost everything during the Civil War. Thomas was 16 when the war ended, old enough to have fought but young enough that his father had managed to keep him out of the Confederate Army through various connections and bribes. After the war, with nothing left in Virginia, Thomas and his father headed west, eventually settling in Texas where land was cheap and opportunities existed for men willing to work hard. Thomas's father died of a heart attack 5 years after they arrived, leaving Thomas with a modest ranch and a deep understanding of how quickly everything you build can disappear. Thomas had never married, though not for lack of opportunities. Several women in the area had made their interest clear, but Thomas had never felt the connection he thought marriage should require. He had convinced himself he was simply meant to be alone, that some men were built for solitude and hard work rather than family and companionship. But meeting Sarah changed something fundamental in him, awakening feelings he had thought did not exist. The problem was that acting on those feelings would require him to defy everything his society believed and risk everything he had built. Interracial relationships were not just frowned upon in Texas in 1879. They were dangerous, potentially deadly for both parties involved. But Thomas found he could not simply ignore what he felt. He began looking for legitimate reasons to interact with Sarah, small ways to help her without being obvious or intrusive. When he heard she was struggling to repair her fence after a storm damaged it, he rode over one morning with extra supplies and offered to help, explaining that he had materials he did not need, and it seemed wasteful to let them sit unused. Sarah was suspicious of his motives, but also practical enough to accept help when it was offered. They worked together that morning, speaking little but developing a comfortable rhythm as they repaired the fence. Thomas left without asking for anything in return, and Sarah found herself confused by this white man, who seemed genuinely kind without expecting payment or favors. Over the following months, Thomas found other ways to help Sarah. He brought her seeds that would grow better in the local soil than what she had been using. He taught her better techniques for managing her water supply during the dry season. He helped her round up cattle that had wandered onto her property, animals she could claim as her own if she could prove she had been caring for them. Each time, he was respectful and careful never to overstep boundaries or make Sarah feel pressured or uncomfortable. He never asked for anything in return, never suggested that his help entitled him to her time or attention. He was simply there, patient and kind, and waiting for something he was not even sure would ever happen. Sarah began to look forward to Thomas's visits even as she questioned her own reactions. She told herself she was being practical, that accepting his help was simply smart survival strategy. But she could not deny that she felt something when he was around, a warmth and safety that she had not experienced with anyone since her parents died. She found herself watching the road, hoping to see his horse approaching, and then feeling disappointed when days passed without him appearing. She started asking questions about him in town, learning that he was respected as an honest rancher who paid his debts and treated his workers fairly, even the Mexican laborers that other ranchers exploited. She learned that he kept to himself mostly, that he had never been married, that people considered him a good man even if he was a bit odd in his solitary ways. The first real conversation between Sarah and Thomas happened on a hot afternoon when Sarah's well collapsed, leaving her without access to water on her property. She was trying to dig it out by herself, exhausted and frustrated and close to tears, because this felt like one disaster too many in a series of endless setbacks. Thomas rode up and saw her struggling, and without a word, he climbed down into the well and began helping her clear the debris and reinforce the walls. They worked together for hours in the oppressive heat, and somewhere in the middle of that physical labor, they began to talk, really talk, about more than just practical matters. Sarah told Thomas about her parents, about growing up in slavery, and then in the difficult years after emancipation. She told him about watching her parents work themselves to death for nothing, and about her determination not to let their sacrifices be meaningless. Thomas listened without interrupting, without offering the empty platitudes or defensive arguments that many white people gave when black people spoke about their experiences. He simply listened and acknowledged the truth of what she was saying, and Sarah felt something shift inside her, a small crack in the protective walls she had built around her heart. Thomas shared his own story, about losing everything after the war, about watching his father grieve himself to death over what the Confederacy had cost them, about the loneliness of building a life with no family or real connections. He admitted that he had grown up believing certain things about black people, things his society had taught him were true, but that the war and its aftermath and his years in Texas had shown him how wrong those beliefs were. He said he was still learning, still unlearning prejudices that had been pounded into him since childhood, and that sometimes he probably said or did the wrong thing without realizing it. Sarah appreciated his honesty, the fact that he did not pretend to be perfect or claim he was colorblind or any of the other comfortable lies white people sometimes told themselves. As the sun began to set and they finally finished repairing the well, Sarah invited Thomas to stay for supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread that was all she had to offer. Thomas accepted, and they sat on rough wooden chairs outside her small house, eating and talking as the desert sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple. For the first time since her parents died, Sarah felt like she was not completely alone, like maybe she had found someone who saw her as a whole person rather than just a black woman to be either feared, pitied, or exploited. And Thomas felt like he had found what he had been unconsciously searching for his entire life, a connection that went deeper than shared circumstances or social convenience, something that felt essential and true. After that evening, Thomas and Sarah's relationship deepened in ways that both excited and terrified them. Thomas began visiting more openly, no longer pretending he just happened to be passing by or needed to check on something in the area. Sarah stopped questioning his motives and started accepting that maybe his interest in her was genuine and not some complicated scheme to take advantage of her. They would work together on projects around her property, then sit and talk for hours about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from practical matters of farming and ranching to deeper questions about life and meaning, and what kind of world they wanted to see. Thomas discovered that Sarah was not just beautiful and strong, but also brilliant and insightful in ways that constantly surprised him. She had taught herself to read during the brief period after emancipation when freed slaves had access to schools, and she had continued educating herself by reading every book and newspaper she could get her hands on. She understood politics and economics, could debate philosophy and ethics, and had a natural wisdom that came from surviving impossible circumstances. Thomas found himself bringing her books from his own collection, and they would discuss what they read, sometimes agreeing and sometimes arguing, but always respecting each other's perspectives. Sarah learned that Thomas was different from any white man she had encountered before. He listened more than he spoke, admitted when he did not know something, and genuinely seemed interested in understanding her experiences rather than dismissing them. He never tried to minimize the reality of racism or suggest that her struggles were her own fault. He acknowledged the advantages his white skin had given him and the disadvantages her black skin imposed on her, and he seemed genuinely troubled by the injustice of it. Sarah began to trust him in ways she had never expected to trust any white person, let alone a white man. But their growing closeness did not go unnoticed in the community. Other black settlers began warning Sarah that she was playing with fire, that getting involved with a white man would only lead to heartbreak or worse. They reminded her of black women who had been lynched for relationships with white men, of the violence that could come from jealous white people who saw interracial relationships as threats to the social order. Some of the black community members began distancing themselves from Sarah, not wanting to be associated with someone who was breaking such fundamental social rules. This isolation hurt Sarah deeply, but she also understood their fear and could not entirely blame them for protecting themselves. Thomas faced his own backlash from the white community. Other ranchers began making comments about him spending time with that black woman, asking pointed questions about what exactly he was doing over at her property so often. Some were merely curious or disapproving, but others were hostile, warning Thomas that he was damaging his reputation, and that there would be consequences if he continued down this path. Thomas's response was to tell them, as politely as possible, that his personal life was his own business, and they could think whatever they wanted. But he understood that every visit to Sarah's property was increasing the danger for both of them, and he struggled with whether he had the right to put her at risk for his feelings. 6 months after they first began spending real time together, Thomas and Sarah had to confront the question they had both been avoiding. What exactly was happening between them, and what did they want it to become? The conversation happened on a cold November evening, with the first winter winds blowing across the plains and a fire crackling in Sarah's small fireplace. Thomas had come to help Sarah prepare her property for winter, reinforcing her house against the cold and making sure she had enough firewood stored. As they sat together after finishing the work, Sarah finally asked the question that had been building for weeks. She asked Thomas what he wanted from her, what he saw when he looked at their relationship, because she needed to know if she was being foolish to hope for something more. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah braced herself for disappointment, for the revelation that she had been naive to think a white man could truly love a black woman as an equal. But then Thomas took her hand, the first time he had initiated physical contact beyond helping her over rough ground or handing her tools, and he told her the truth. He said he loved her. He said he had probably loved her from the moment he first saw her in the trading post, though he had not understood what he was feeling at the time. He said he knew that loving her was complicated and dangerous and would make both their lives harder, but he could not change his heart and did not want to. He said he understood if she did not feel the same way, if she could not risk loving a white man in a world that would punish her for it. But he needed her to know that he was willing to wait, that he would be patient for as long as it took for her to trust him enough to let him love her. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she was not sure if they were tears of joy or fear or some complicated mixture of both. She admitted that she had feelings for Thomas too, that she had fought against them because she knew how dangerous they were, but that her heart had betrayed her practical mind. She told him she was scared, not just of what other people might do, but of being vulnerable, of trusting someone with her heart when her experience had taught her that people could not be trusted. She said she needed time to figure out if she was brave enough to love him openly or if the fear would always win. Thomas told her he would wait as long as she needed, that he was not going anywhere, that she could set the pace and the terms and he would respect whatever boundaries she needed. He promised that his love was not conditional on her immediately reciprocating or on their relationship looking a certain way. He said he would be her friend, her helper, her companion, whatever she was comfortable with, and if that was all their relationship ever became, he would accept it. But he wanted her to know that his heart was hers if she ever decided she wanted it, and that nothing and no one would change that. Sarah made no promises that night, but she did not send Thomas away either. She simply held his hand and sat beside him in the firelight, and they both understood that they had crossed a threshold they could not uncross, that they had acknowledged feelings that would shape everything that came after, for better or worse. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was one of the coldest on record in western Texas, with snowstorms that buried properties and temperatures that killed livestock and threatened human lives. Sarah struggled to keep herself and her few animals alive through the brutal cold, burning through her firewood supply faster than expected and running low on food as the weeks stretched on. Thomas checked on her as often as the weather allowed, bringing supplies and helping her manage the crisis, And during those long, dark months, their bond deepened into something that felt unbreakable. In late February, when the worst of the winter had passed but spring had not yet arrived, disaster struck Sarah's property. A fire started in her small barn, probably from a lantern that tipped over and spread quickly through the dry wood. Sarah was inside her house when she smelled smoke, and she ran out to find her barn engulfed in flames with her 2 cows and her mule trapped inside. She tried to get to the animals, but the heat drove her back, and she stood helpless watching everything she had worked so hard to build literally go up in smoke. Her livestock died in the fire, her stored hay was destroyed, and even some of her farming tools that she had kept in the barn were lost. Thomas arrived 2 days after the fire when he came for his regular check on Sarah. He found her sitting in the ashes of her barn, staring at the destruction with empty eyes, and he understood immediately that this might be the final blow that broke her spirit. He sat down beside her without speaking, and they stayed that way for a long time, just sitting together in the ruins. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice flat and defeated. She said she did not know if she could keep fighting, that maybe this was the universe telling her she was not meant to have her own land, that maybe she should give up and find work as a domestic servant in town, where at least she would have steady meals and a roof over her head. Thomas listened, and then he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. He told Sarah that giving up was always an option, but that it should never be the only option. He said he understood she was exhausted and heartbroken, and that she had every right to feel that way. But he also reminded her of how far she had come, how much she had already survived, how strong she had proven herself to be. He told her that if she decided to keep fighting, she would not have to fight alone anymore. He offered to loan her the money to replace her livestock and rebuild her barn, not as charity, but as an investment in someone he believed in. He said she could pay him back over time or never. It did not matter to him. What mattered was that she had the chance to keep her dream alive if she wanted it. Sarah looked at Thomas for a long moment, seeing not pity but respect in his eyes, and she made a decision that took more courage than anything she had done before. She said yes. She would accept his help, she would rebuild, and she would stop fighting against the feelings she had for him. She told him she loved him, that she was terrified of what that meant, but that she was done pretending it was not true. She said if he really meant what he had said about waiting for her heart, then he did not need to wait anymore because it was his for the taking, consequences and danger and all. Thomas pulled Sarah into his arms, and they held each other in the ashes of her barn. 2 people from different worlds choosing to build something together despite everything that would try to tear them apart. It was not a perfect romantic moment. They were both dirty and exhausted and scared of what their decision would mean. But it was real and honest and true, and that was more valuable than any fairy tale romance could ever be. Thomas and Sarah's relationship became public knowledge shortly after that day in the ashes, though not by their choice. Someone saw Thomas embracing Sarah, and word spread through the community like wildfire. The reactions were exactly as harsh as they had feared. The black community felt betrayed, believing Sarah was abandoning her own people for the relative privilege of being associated with a white man. The white community was outraged, seeing Thomas as a race traitor and Sarah as a black woman who did not know her place. Both of them received threats, ugly letters and messages that promised violence if they continued their relationship. Despite the hostility, Thomas and Sarah refused to hide their love or pretend it did not exist. Thomas helped Sarah rebuild her barn, and he did it openly, often staying at her property past dark and making no secret of the fact that their relationship had become romantic. Sarah continued to attend the black church on Sundays, holding her head high despite the cold shoulders and whispered comments, refusing to be ashamed of loving a good man regardless of his skin color. They faced their opposition together, united by a bond that grew stronger every time it was tested. Thomas proposed marriage 6 months after they officially became a couple, presenting Sarah with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. Sarah said yes without hesitation. understanding that marriage would intensify the dangers they faced, but also believing that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. They discovered that no church would marry them and no justice of the peace would perform the ceremony. So they stood together in Sarah's small house with no witnesses except each other and God. And they spoke their vows and exchanged rings, and declared themselves married in their hearts, even if the law would not recognize it. Their married life was not easy. They faced constant harassment and discrimination. Some of Thomas's former friends refused to associate with him anymore. Sarah was excluded from both black and white social circles, considered an outcast by everyone. They struggled financially because Thomas's decision to marry Sarah cost him business relationships and contracts that had been important to his ranch's success. But they also found unexpected allies, a handful of people from both communities who admired their courage and quietly supported them. A Mexican family that farmed nearby brought them food and offered friendship. An elderly white widow invited them to dinner, shocking the community by treating them as a legitimate couple. A young black couple who were also in an interracial relationship reached out, grateful to know they were not alone. 2 years after Thomas and Sarah married in their private ceremony, tragedy struck in a way that tested everything they had built. A group of white men, emboldened by alcohol and hate, decided to teach Thomas a lesson about race mixing. They rode onto his ranch one night, set fire to his barn, and when Thomas ran out to fight the fire, they beat him savagely, leaving him broken and bleeding in the dirt. Sarah heard the commotion from her property and rode over to find Thomas unconscious, his face swollen and bloody, bones clearly broken. She got him into her wagon and drove him 20 miles to the nearest doctor, a white man who was known for treating everyone regardless of race or ability to pay. The doctor saved Thomas's life, but told Sarah that his injuries were severe and recovery would be long and uncertain. Thomas had broken ribs, a broken arm, internal injuries that could cause problems for the rest of his life, and a head injury that left him confused and disoriented for weeks. Sarah moved Thomas to her property because she knew he would be safer there, where they could see anyone approaching from a distance, and she nursed him through his recovery with a fierce devotion that impressed everyone who witnessed it. She barely slept for weeks, constantly checking on him, cleaning his wounds, forcing him to eat and drink, talking to him during his moments of consciousness, and holding his hand through his nightmares. The attack on Thomas galvanized some members of the community who had previously stayed silent. A group of ranchers, including several who had not approved of Thomas's marriage, banded together to hunt down the men who had committed the assault. They found 3 of them and turned them over to the law, and surprisingly, given the racial dynamics of the time, the men were actually prosecuted and sentenced to prison time. It was not justice in any complete sense, but it was more than anyone expected, and it sent a message that maybe not everyone in the community was willing to tolerate vigilante violence. Thomas recovered slowly, his body healing but his spirit shaken by the violence he had endured. There were days when he questioned whether their love was worth the pain it caused, whether they should separate for their own safety and the safety of anyone who supported them. But Sarah never wavered. She told Thomas that giving in to fear and hate meant letting the worst people in the world dictate how they lived, and she refused to do that. She said their love was not hurting anyone, that it was the prejudice and violence of others that caused harm, and they should not take responsibility for other people's hatred. Her strength gave Thomas the courage to keep fighting, and gradually he healed both physically and emotionally, emerging from the ordeal more committed than ever to their life together. As Thomas and Sarah moved into their 40s, they had built something remarkable despite all the obstacles they had faced. Their combined properties had become a successful operation, proving that cooperation and hard work could overcome almost any disadvantage. They employed workers from all backgrounds, paying fair wages and treating everyone with dignity regardless of race. Their ranch became known as a place where interracial families and mixed groups could gather without fear, a small pocket of tolerance in a generally intolerant world. They never had children of their own, something Sarah mourned privately, but they became mentors and parental figures to countless young people who needed guidance and support. Thomas and Sarah's relationship became something of a legend in western Texas, a story that people told about the power of love to overcome hate. Some people told their story as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of crossing racial boundaries, but others told it as an inspiration, proof that people could choose love over prejudice if they had enough courage. Young couples in interracial relationships would seek out Thomas and Sarah, asking for advice and support, and the older couple always welcomed them, sharing their experiences and offering what wisdom they had gained through their struggles. As they aged, Thomas and Sarah watched the world slowly change around them. The extreme hostility they had faced in their early years gradually softened into grudging acceptance, and then, for some people, into genuine respect. They were never fully accepted by mainstream society, never invited to all the social functions or welcomed in all establishments, but they carved out a space where they could live with dignity and peace. They proved that an interracial marriage could last, could be built on real love and mutual respect, rather than the fetishization or exploitation that many people assumed must underlie such relationships. Thomas Whitfield died at 68 after a short illness, surrounded by Sarah and the many young people whose lives they had touched. Sarah mourned him deeply but also took comfort in the life they had built together, the love they had shared, and the example they had set. She lived another 12 years after Thomas's death, continuing to run their ranch and support young couples who were fighting the same battles she and Thomas had fought decades earlier. She never remarried, saying that she had been blessed with one great love in her lifetime, and that was more than most people ever got. Sarah Mee Whitfield died in her sleep at 80 years old, having lived long enough to see the beginning of the 20th century and the slow progress toward racial equality that would continue for generations. She was buried next to Thomas on a hill overlooking the land they had built together, and her funeral was attended by a diverse crowd of people whose lives had been changed by her courage and example. Black and white, rich and poor, young and old, they came to pay respects to a woman who had refused to let the world tell her who she could love or what her life could be. The story of Sarah and Thomas is important not because their love was perfect, or because they solved all the problems of racism and prejudice. It is important because they were real people who faced real hatred and violence and chose to love each other anyway. They showed that change happens not through grand gestures or sweeping legislation alone, but through individual people making brave choices in their personal lives, standing up for what they believe is right even when the cost is high. Their relationship was not a solution to racism, but it was a challenge to it, a living refutation of the idea that people of different races could not build genuine, lasting, equal partnerships. Their story reminds us that love has always been a revolutionary act, especially love that crosses the boundaries that society tries to maintain. Every interracial couple that exists today stands on the foundation built by people like Sarah and Thomas, people who risked everything to prove that the content of someone's character matters more than the color of their skin. Their legacy is not just in the land they built or the people they mentored, but in the simple fact that they loved each other openly and honestly in a world that demanded they hide or deny their feelings. They waited for each other's hearts, took the time to build trust and understanding, and then defended their love against every attack and obstacle. That is the kind of love story that deserves to be remembered, not because it was easy or romantic in a conventional sense, but because it was real and brave and ultimately triumphant. Sarah and Thomas proved that waiting for the right person, being patient with love, and having the courage to choose connection over conformity can create something beautiful enough to change the world, one heart at a time.